Well, welcome everybody. My name is John Merrill. I'm president of Petaluma Museum, and welcome to Flight, the exhibition. We're honoring our local aviators here, from Mr. Wiseman up to our World War II heroes, and I know they don't necessarily like to be thought of as that, but they truly are, and we're forever grateful for their actions for our freedom. So, very special speaker today, of course, Art Cader. And Art was born in 1921 in Petaluma, so you don't get more native than Art. Art has 4 children, 8 grandchildren, and many more grandchildren, so great-grandchildren, so that's an accomplishment in itself. A little bit about Art. You know, I met Art quite a few years ago, kind of being involved in city government. And, a lot of these folks kind of coming in and out of our lives, but we really don't know the history that they carry along with them. And I found out, Art's involvement as a bomber pilot in World War II, and it just completely blew me away. I mean, it's just a really amazing thing. So it's always kind of nice when you make that story and that connection to that person. In regards to his mission, he was a B24 Bomber Pilot in World War II, 46 combat missions, and interestingly enough, one of the longest bombing missions of the war at 15 flying hours. There was a battle over the Pacific, and one of the lead bombers was shot down. And despite heavy damage to Art's own plane, he provided coverage for the crew that was on the ground, and because of that, he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his bravery and heroism. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mr. Art Cader.
Thank you, Joe. One thing I would like to tell you, the heroes to me are the ones that didn't come back. And they were the heroes. The rest of us just did our job. What I'd like to do is just tell you kind of what you have to do to become a pilot, and then let you know a few of the things that we did when we went against the enemy. To start with, 1941, Japanese declared war, and I enlisted in 1942. And actually, I signed up for the cadet flying program, and for about a month or so, I went to the library every night and studied navigation and weather and everything. I didn't know what they're going to ask on the test. And that time, you could apply if you had a high school education, and that's what I had. So anyhow, about a month and a half afterward, they called me from Oakland to come down and take the test with other people. And I went down there, and at 70 was the mark to get by. That was the lowest. I think I got 71. No, I'm not kidding you. I had algebra, and I never had algebra or anything. I just took out of high school. Most of the other applicants had college educations. So anyhow, I got past there. And it was interesting. Then I had to go home, and I had to wait 6 months before they called me up, because there evidently was a big backlog. So anyhow, they called me up, and we went down to Oakland, and they gave you an examination from top to bottom and inside and outside. I mean, they really worked you over. And then I went down to Texas. Not Texas, to Tennessee. And there we got our uniform. We did some marching and a few things, and we stayed there about 30 days. And then we went to Maxwell Field, Alabama. That was called pre-flight. And there, it's a beautiful place. Accommodations were good, the food was excellent, and we had our uniforms there. And everywhere you go there, you just didn't walk places. You went as a group. That's it. They knew what you were going to do every minute, and they told you. And what we did there is we did mostly marching and calisthenics in the morning, and they had you running 3 to 5 miles. They really worked you into shape. And then in the afternoon, you went to school. So you were busy all the time. At nighttime, you just sat around and studied. Well, anyhow, we were there for about 60 days. And actually, the new people, the first ones in, would harass the new ones. So we were the new ones. They'd stop you on the street and have you do push-ups. Then they'd have you eat square meals. They'd do everything to tantalize you. Well, anyhow, when they left, they shook hands with us. Then we became the guys. And then we harassed the other ones below us. So anyhow, after that, then we went to primary. And primary was all run by civilians. In other words, they'd come to somebody like, say, Dick Hodges down here that ran the airport. and they would say, we're going to contract you, and you use civilian pilots. You had just one Czech pilot was a officer, and the rest of them were all civilians. And we got about 40 hours, 50 hours in biplanes. This was PT-17s and the Stearmans, and you had to do everything. I mean, you had to spin them, you had to land them, you had to do everything. They were tough. And we had 3 of us in the room, and one day I came back in the room, and I was the only one there. They washed out 45% of our class. That's how tough they were. I mean, you had to do everything just right, or you weren't there. And it was kind of tough, because so what happened is that these people became navigators and bombardiers. Nobody signs up to be a bombardier or a navigator. Everybody signs up to be a pilot, you know. And so that's what happened. So it was tough. But anyhow, from there we went on to basics, and we flew PT-13s. They're all metal airplanes, and we flew them. And they'd call you in sometimes at 2 o'clock in the morning. You had to get up and you had to fly. They did you right around the clock, and then they let you eat, and then you went to school. I mean, you had something going every minute. I mean, they controlled you well. And anyhow, I enjoyed that flying. And then they gave us a choice. They said, now, would you like to fly a single engine or a twin engine? And I said, I like multi-engine for a couple of reasons. I wanted more than one engine in front of me, and I enjoyed company. So anyhow, they allowed me to go to a twin engine. And from there, we went to, Valdosta, Georgia. I was staying in the South all the time. Bennettsville, South Carolina was our primary. Cochran Field, Georgia was our basic, and then we went there. And these we flew twin engine planes. And again, we flew 40, 50 hours, and we'd have 2 pilots. And we'd go to the instructor, and then when we got good, then 2 of us would fly, and we'd interchange. We'd go all over the place. We'd fly down to Florida and everything. So that was interesting. And then after that, you had graduation. And this was something. You had the uniform, and they presented you with your wings, and the commander was out there, and they had a band, and they had everything. It was very emotional and nice. And so then when we got done with that, we were assigned. And I was assigned to B24s. Now, that's a B-24 over there, and it has 10 50 caliber. This is what a 50 caliber looks like. It's huge. And this is what they shot in there. And we had 10 guns, and it had a crew of 10 people, including myself. And you had to have 307 hours in the 24 to become a first pilot. And so that's what I had. And we flew around all the country. We'd fly into Chicago. And I liked the plane. It was a great one. And so I really enjoyed that. And so when we got done with that, then we were to pick up a crew. And we picked up a crew in Kansas City. And what happened is that I didn't have a crew, and there was a crew there that had just lost their pilot. He broke his shoulder. So anyhow, they said, here's a pilot, here's a crew. So we got together, and they were very good. But they weren't too sure, because they liked the person they had. They didn't know me, and I didn't know them. And we flew together for maybe a short time. And then we went to South Pacific. We went to Guadalcanal. Beautiful Guadalcanal. But anyhow, that's when we started to fly out of there. And we flew missions to Bougainville. These are names I throw at you, and the areas around there. And it took about 4 missions. It's amazing. You fly, and there's so much there. You will see Joe has pictures of the cockpit of the airplane, a B-24. I mean, it's huge, and it's very interesting. And so we would fly around and do these different missions. And like I say, at first you really don't know too much, because you're just concentrating. And then after about the 5th mission, you start to notice everything. You notice that little instrument, if it moves that much, you notice it. And it's kind of interesting, because the crew, I had a bombardier and one gunner. And he asked me one day, he said, you mind if we fly with another crew? And I said, no, that's okay, because I knew that they liked their pilot. They just wanted to see. And so I said, no, that's okay. So that next day, they flew again to this place called Bougainville, and they're both killed. Yeah, their plane crashed. So there was a navigator that came into our group, and he was a West Pointer. And he was to be going right up to headquarters, but he had no experience. So they gave him to me, and he was good. I mean, this guy, he must have had, I think, ice in his veins, because we'd be going over a target, and they'd be shooting at us, and fighters would be coming in, and his job was to pass the ammunition up to the top turret map, which was on top there. And he would give us headings to go to the target, this and that, and then when we got there, then he'd stand up, he'd pass the ammunition up, just quiet, like he was, I couldn't get over the guy. It was just interesting how calm he was, and I was sweating. So anyhow, that's what happened there. So what we did is we started to move up the islands, because basically we went to about 6 different places. Our destination was the Philippines, and then from there we were going on different. So we went to a place called Biak. I don't know if any of you remember a family called the Ruffs in town here. His name was Carl, his father was Carl Ruff, and he had a distributor of, I think, one of the gas companies here. They had 2 boys and a girl, and one of the boys was named Terry and one was named Larry. And funny, as they took the island, they flew us in there. And this Terry was a bombardier, and his plane went down. So he was killed. And this Larry, he was a pilot, and he was good. And he finished his missions, and he was on his way home, and he got into a Jeep accident and was killed. So when I got home, I went and saw the families. That's not an easy job, but I had to do it. And that was a real tragedy there. Well, we flew out of there, and then we went to the Admiralty Island, one of the other places. And then our biggest target at that time was Truck Island. I don't know if you know Truck Island. You know that.
I dove there.
Did you really?
I scuba dove there.
Yeah, and I think Don Smith did too. Yeah.
I was with them.
Yeah. And anyhow, there was a lot of sunk airplanes, a lot of sunk ships in there. It was a big island, and the Japanese really had it well protected, and a lot of fighters. And that was a rough mission. And anyhow, we took off, and we couldn't carry fighters with us because our missions are all too long, and so we had to go in unescorted. And so we got there, the Japanese would throw phosphorus bombs. They'd stay in front and throw these things out. They didn't do anything, but they went up in the air, they scared you to death. So anyhow, then we got to the target. Then they would attack you. And then when we got to the target, then we lined ourselves up to bomb the target. Well, I got my engine shot out just as I was going on the target. Well, you don't, when we say feather an engine, in other words, you turn it so it goes in the wind like that. But I didn't feather it, because if they saw a feathered engine, they were going to go after you. So you just let the thing prop go through there, and you go in on 3 engines. And I did that, and anyhow, we had ACAC, and then we had fire. We had our plane shot up. Luckily, nobody was hurt. But we had the 3 engines, and it was a mess. And we couldn't get back to our base. The plane would fall apart. So they directed us to a little place called Green Island. If you ever look on a map around that area, it's a place called Green Island. And the Seabees would go into these places, and they would rock out an airfield in a matter of days. They didn't have to have any environmental impact studies or permits or anything. They just went in and they did a beautiful job. They were good. But they had just finished this field, so we got in there all right. And we left the plane there because we couldn't fly it. It was all shot up. And then they picked us up and took us back to our base. And then we continued on up. And then we went to an island called Noompur. And Noompur was our jumping off place for Borneo. And so this was where we did 15 hours. And it was the longest mission during World War II for B24 bombers as a group. And so what we did is that we had to have 2 extra big tanks put in places where our bombs were. So we carried an extra 800 gallons of fuel. And we had to use less ammunition, so we had to throw a lot of the ammunition out. because, well, it was weight, and you had to keep the weight down. And another thing is that we had to take off at night. Well, we went on this one mission, and it was, they didn't know we were coming, luckily. And so we got in before we got shot up too bad and got out of there. But then it was about a week later, a fellow named Doherty, he was a major. And we were back there, and he came up to me, he said, would you volunteer to go on another mission? Because on those missions, we just used the experienced pilots, because it was rough, and we didn't send any new people out, because it was, you just had to know your business. And I said, no, I will not volunteer. That's a terrible word. I refuse to volunteer, but I'll go. And I knew a couple of our crew needed, you can hear me all right back there? Crew that they needed another mission. So we were all ready to go home then. We were just about done. So what we had to do, we couldn't come back at nighttime because there was just a little island. You wouldn't even find them. You'd go right out. So we had to leave at 4 o'clock in the morning. And we never, we don't take off at night. We don't do that. So it was interesting because they put 2 trucks at the end of the runway so we could see where lights were. And then we revved up the engines as far as they'd go and we'd take off. And we'd get just to the end and we'd pull back and we'd just skim over the water. And anyhow, we got off, but we had a full load. We carried 250 pounders and incendiaries. Our object was to, there was a place called Petaluma, that's where we were going. And these were the big oil fields. And the Japanese, they needed the oil, and this is where they got the majority of the oil. And so our job was to drop the 250s, blow up the tanks, and then drop the incendiaries and start everything on fire. And we did that. But when we got there, we were all jumped by fighters. And this wasn't very good. I mean, they were good, and there was plenty of them. We had no escort or anything. And we got over there, and we dropped our bombs. And on the way out, a lead ship was shot down. A fighter plane came right around like this. It's a funny thing. I can tell you, it's experience that does everything. And you could see that. I was flying in number 3 position was over here. My friend was flying in 2, and the leader was flying in here. And anyhow, he came all around and hit the leader. We didn't know who he was going to hit. He could hit any of the 3 of us. But he hit the leader, and the leader just started off on the side. And my friend over there, the plane, actually, as it shot, it came right toward him and tried to crash him. But he threw his wing up, and the plane went right underneath his wing. And because there are a lot of, and then how I saw this plane, it just broke up the formation. And the person behind me, he had an engine shot out, and his wingman both sides. I got on his wing and took him home. That's the type of people I flew with. They're very concerned about each other. And anyhow, I followed the lead plane down because he went off to the side. And then we saw 5 of them bail out. And the Japanese fighters were around there, and they shot them all down. So they're all killed. We kept following the plane as it went on. And what happened is inside the plane, and I'll tell you why later, we had one man who was on my crew, but he was in Australia. So he just got back in time, and they needed another gunner, so they took him in place. And what happened, the people in back didn't know. They were waiting for orders for them to bail out, and they didn't hear anything. So one of them went up there, and they saw that they were all gone, and that's the ones that were all killed. So anyhow, then they bailed out, and this one fellow, his name was Menzie. He wore big overalls, and he was quite a character. Never kind of thought much that he would do something. But anyhow, they bailed out, and one of the crew members wouldn't go. He petrified. So this guy Menzie grabbed him like this. There was a hole in the B24 where you could bail out. He held him like this, and he threw him out the hole. And then he went out, and then this other gentleman that I'll tell you about in a minute went out too. So they all went out, and what we did is we send messages back to base over there to give them position. So with the submarines always went with us on these missions, and they would come in close to the islands. And boy, I had a lot of respect for those people, because they would pick up anybody that was down. And luckily, a submarine was in the area, not to pick up any of these, but for a different reason. And they found these people. So they picked them all up, and they took them to Australia. And, you know, I never heard anymore, because we kept following the plane down, and then there was nothing else we could do, so we went home. And we got hit pretty good ourselves with a lot of flack. And anyhow, we had to go 1,000 miles. It was 2,500 miles round trip. So it was 15 hours, and so the plane was kind of damaged, but we got back all right. And funny thing, when we landed, there was a general there that came up to me and said, "You're the first plane back." And I said, "Well, we sent messages back to tell you where these people were." They didn't receive any messages from any of the planes, none of them. And so it was just a lucky deal that they picked them up over there. So that was quite interesting. But anyhow, one of my engineers, I had two of them on there, and he went over to the number 3 engine where we had trouble. What happened is that when we were over the target, all of a sudden heat became, there was heat in the cockpit and all around the plane. We had openers where we got heat in there, and this heat just kept coming in. I couldn't figure it out. So I told them, I called and I said, "Everybody open up any heaters that are in their area, you know." And what they did is, they did, and then the heat went down enough. We were friends on the crew, but not buddies. I mean, this was all serious, but you know, I had the life of 10 people in my hand, you know, and you had to, when you said something, it had to be done right. And anyhow, they were a good crew. They did everything. And so anyhow, when we got back and landed, the engineer went out. He picked up a piece of flak, this big, metal, in number 3 engine, right into the supercharger. And that's why the heat broke that and the heat came through. That thing could have gone right through the whole engine. So we were very lucky that way there, you know. And anyhow, then we made it back and we were ready to go home. But what I tell you, on this first mission over truck, when we had all that problem, there was a gunner in the tail gun, and every year he would call everybody in the crew, April the 1st. He would call them and just say hi, because he said that mission he would never forget. So he died 12 years ago, and I've called everybody ever since April 1st. But a year ago, I called the engineer's wife, and we had a lot of trouble getting people out to get to them, you know, because they're all back in Georgia and that area there. So I couldn't get to her to 9:30 at night, and I got to her, and she said, I've been waiting for your call. I mean, it was very tough for me to talk after that, you know. So anyhow, we talked for a long time. I wanted to know about her kids and what she did and things like that. And it made me feel better. But there's only one person left now on the crew. His name is John Merrill, and I call him all the time. And he was also an engineer, went to engineer school, and he was good. I could really depend on him. He was the oldest man. And I never asked anybody whether they're married or they had kids. I didn't want to, you know, I just didn't want, I just want to keep it as strictly as a business, because that's what it was. And so he and I are very close, and we talk to each other. But one time our bombs hung up. Well, one of them was still there, and he got out in between there. The 24 is huge. He kicked the bomb, and it went out. That's the kind of guy he was. You know, you could depend on him. the whole crew was, they were just good people. They knew what they were doing, and that's one of the big reasons we got home. So I thought you might like to know those stories. Thank you for coming. That was nice.
Art, in the picture there, is that Hap Arnold with you?
Well, his name was Hap Arnold. Well, it wasn't Hap Arnold. You're thinking.
Wasn't the Hap Arnold?
No.
Okay.
No, this is a picture of the crew, and that's a B24, the same one we flew. Not that one, but the same thing. But I have something interesting here. I got this quite a while ago.
Art, would you use
one
the
other thing
mic?
I meant to tell you, you used to say, how would I know what happened on the airplane? Well, what happened quite a few years afterward, for some reason or other, somebody called me, and there was a gentleman that was on that plane, and he lived in Florida, and I contacted him. And when someone was back that area, we went over and saw him, and he was the last one to jump out of that plane. And that's how I knew what happened on there. Mm-hmm. So that was quite interesting. So that's how yes, Mildred.
What were the dates, Art, that you were doing this flying? Was it earlier in the war?
No, well, it was in 43, at the end of 43, into 44, you see. And yes, Harry.
What rank did you achieve before you got out?
A captain. Yeah. And anyhow, I got this quite a while ago, and this was declassified about after about 30 years. It was the invasion of Japan, and this is everything, and it shows you how many. They had about 8 to 10,000 planes still left in Japan, and they're all spread around different places, and they knew we were going to land, and they've actually put 9 divisions in the area where they were going to land for invasion. And this thing tells everything. We could have lost, we figure, well over 500,000 people. Because what they planned on doing with the kamikazes, and it tells it right here, they were going after the troop ships. They weren't going after anything else. And they used midget submarines in there. And these were kamikazes. They were going to kill themselves, you know. And that's what they had planned. And I told Joe, I'd leave him this, and if anybody ever wants one, he could go down to Kiko's and have them all copied out. It's very interesting. It's very long. You get everything detailed out. How so? Then they dropped the atomic bomb before this, and I thought that was great. I just wish it would have done a year ahead of time. We would have saved a lot of people, because if they would have invaded, it would have been a massacre. So the bomb was a terrible thing, but it saved American lives, you know. So I thought you might like to know that. I think it's kind of nice that people get to know what some of these things would happen, you know. I get a little, I can't do this too much, I get a little emotional sometimes. You know, you think about these people, what they go through, and they have, and how much good they have, and I was very proud to serve my country.
And we don't owe any apologies for what we did.
No, not at all, Harry. No. We're just very lucky. I think I like to see young people know a little bit about what goes on, you know. I hope it doesn't happen again. Thank you all.
I'd like to share this DVD with you when Art got his Distinguished Flying Cross.
If anybody'd like to see it.
service with a word of prayer to invite our God to be with us as we do honor this evening. Let us pray. Our God of heaven and earth, we gather before you this day to give honor and recognize the heroic and faithful service rendered by your servant, Mr. Cader, and the men and women who served with him over the waters of the Pacific Ocean. Almighty God, we know that it is taught in your word to serve one another with purpose and righteousness. God, we recognize Mr. Cader's service to our nation, and we give thanks for all that was given by him and the men and women who took on the dangerous missions that would ensure the freedom of this nation and the ability for us to continue our way of life. Almighty God, we continue to pray this day that we, this generation, may take upon us the same courage and dedication that was demonstrated by our fathers and mothers in previous wars. God, may we have the resolution to continue to fight for and uphold freedoms in our way of life. We ask for blessing this day upon Mr. Cader and those who serve with him, and also upon our brothers and sisters who fly in the skies of Iraq, Afghanistan, and in every corner of the globe. May your hand of protection and grace be upon them. And this we pray now, and we do it in your holy name. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. At this time, it's my distinct honor to introduce our official partner, the Commander, 60th Air Mobility, Colonel Steve Burkett. Our honored guest and distinguished combat veteran, Mr. Arthur J. Cader, accompanied by his wife, Selma. His son Bruce and his wife Christine. His daughter Linda. His daughter Janice and her husband Gerald. His grandchildren Michelle, Rebecca, Haley, Olivia, and Rita. His sister Mildred with his nephew Bill. And his great-grandchildren, McKenna, Marissa, Kenna, Daxton, Sana, and Gracie. Mr. Cader is also joined by many personal friends and several fellow veterans, including Mr. Bill Kucheka, a fellow crew member of Mr. Cader's who was on this particular mission. And thank you all for joining us this morning. We are also very honored to have several distinguished guests attending today's ceremony. The Commander of 349th Air Mobility Wing, Brigadier General Thomas Geisler Jr. The Acting Commander, 15th Expeditionary Mobility Task Force, Colonel James Callison. The Vice Commander, 615th Contingency Response Wing, Colonel Richard McLean. The Command Chief Master Sergeant, 15th Expeditionary Mobility Task Force, Chief Master Sergeant James Cody. The Commander, 60th Medical Group, Colonel Lee Payne. The 571st Contingency Response Group, Colonel Like many of their fathers and grandfathers, Mr. Cader defended the freedom of our country and the world during this immense conflict. However, Mr. Cader's actions on 30 September 1944 went above and beyond the call of duty. On this day, he distinguished himself for courage and flight skill, exceeding all expectations. Today, over 60 years after these events, we have a tremendous opportunity to finally and properly honor his service. It is my pleasure to welcome the commander of the 60th Air Mobility Wing, Colonel Steve Arquette, to the podium.
Well, good morning. This certainly is a great day, and as I was talking to Mr. Cader in the back, he said, "You need to slow down a little bit. You're walking too fast. I'm 85 years old." Boy, I'd like to only be as in great shape as it was when I'm 85 years old. And to only have a slight glimmer of a chance to do something as magnificent as you and your efforts did in those dark days during World War II. John Geisler, fellow commanders, I want to thank you all for coming out, especially the family. Thank you all so much. Keep them making laugh up there. So, yeah. He said this is a very emotional day for him. And when I get done, and after we present the award to him, he may make a few comments. You take as long as you need, because we're here for you, because this is your day, sir. And you've given life, and you've given liberty, and I think that's extremely important that we take time today to do this. But as we honor you today, we think back, it's been almost 6 decades that you and your crew took off at 0040 in the morning, and rarely did they do that on those missions, usually in the daytime. But this was an extremely important mission. But 6 decades it took to recognize that great mission. And I'm going to go through a few things, talk a little bit about how he is considered going above and beyond that day and the 43 subsequent missions that he and his crew flew. All in B24s, all of the same crew, and they never lost an airplane, they never lost a crew member, which was significant in the face of the Japanese adversary, which was highly trained, highly motivated, and equipped with state-of-the-art equipment that took us as a nation many years after the bombing of Pearl Harbor to get up to that level where we could go face-to-face and eventually turn the tide in the Pacific with missions such as Mr. Cader led that night. Many of right after the bombings of Pearl Harbor, we rallied everybody, and about that time, Mr. Cader he used to go out to Hampton Field, which was just down in the north of San Francisco, and he used to play tennis out there on the base, and as a young man, he watched the airplanes fly overhead, and he thought that was pretty neat that he grew up in San Rafael, I guess, so not too far from the base. He was turning out to be quite a tennis pro, and he got to know some of the pilots there, I understand. So after the war broke out, he volunteered in 1942 to be an aviation cadet. He applied, was accepted, and off he went down to Alabama for training. And he did very well in his training, and toward the end of his training, they said, "Young man, what kind of airplanes do I fly? One engine or multi-engine?" He told him, "I need multi-engines. I want more than one out in front of me is a good thing." So off he went to learn how to fly the B24, which was a fairly difficult airplane to fly. It had some idiosyncrasies. It was conflict, and once you got to learn those idiosyncrasies and you trained well, you could do anything you needed to do with that airplane. And there was at that time there was you're going out and facing an enemy where you know you are outskilled, in many cases you're outgunned because they have greater airplanes and greater capability, and in some cases a more intense drive motivation. Many folks relied on superstition to get them through the mission, and his mother had given him some flying gloves. He brought them for the first few missions, and then he realized that the rest of the crew was looking for him. He bring the gloves today, because that fellow came back flying after that mission. And he quit bringing the gloves, because he told his crew, he said, never rely on superstition, you need to rely on training. And it's your training that's going to bring you back alive, mission after mission, and that's exactly what it did for them. So after his training, they were assigned to the 72nd Bomb Squad of the 5th Bombardment Group on a small island called Cornisoran Aerodrome. Is that how you pronounce it? Cornisoran?
About 6 little islands, that's good.
Okay. But it was on Northport Island, which is for you. I actually pulled up the map because I had never heard of this island before. I have spent quite a bit of time in the Pacific myself, in the Philippines and traveling around Malaysia and those areas. I had not heard of this place. But as you look, this is Australia down here. This is Papua New Guinea. And right above that is a small island that he was flying out of. His missions took him all the way across all of these gazillion islands here over to the island of Borneo. And that's where the Japanese had their petroleum refinery that was the target of his first mission that they made. And this was a very, very high priority target because the Japanese had infiltrated all throughout the Philippines, all throughout that whole area of the Pacific, and they were dug in. And as I mentioned, they were highly equipped, but they needed fuel to do many of the missions they were doing. And so if we could go knock out that fuel capability, that was going to give us a great ability to continue our island leapfrogging, which we eventually did. But it was a great resistance, so we did that. So typically, a B24 mission was a 9-hour mission. In order to do these missions from that small island just north of Australia to all the way over to Borneo and back, it was a 14 to 15-hour mission. And these were the longest missions in the history of B24. And so a lot of great mission planning went in, but also some other things that we tried to do as many missions as we could because of the Smith-Japanese resistance. They went out without any fighter escort because that distance was too far for the fighters to tag along. They also went with only 40% of the normal fuel allotment, or normal ammunition allotment, because ammunition was heavy and they needed to have as much gas in the airplane as they could, so we sacrificed weight with ammunition, so the gunners didn't have as much to protect themselves. But they only sent the very experienced pilots. And I think he showed up there with a 307 hours, so I guess that made you a very experienced first lieutenant, and he and his crew did very well. But they took off, like I said, at night, and as they approached their target, they ran into some very, very hard opposition, and as they hit the bombs on target, they destroyed the portion of the target they were supposed to, and everybody else got in as well. But he was number 3 in the formation, and they got attacked by fighters, and they eventually took some flak as they went over the target themselves. So his airplane was hit, and as they turned around to leave, we realized that some of the other airplanes weren't going to make it back, and some folks were bailing out. And at that time, the Japanese were a pretty vicious opponent. If they saw anybody coming down in parachutes, they knew that these guys would return again someday, so the fighters would go after the fighting folks who were bailing out of their airplanes. So he and his crew realized the fact that these guys were unprotected. They came out of formation, went down low altitude to try to provide these American pilots who were parachuting down, hopefully be rescued, and provide them air cover so the Japanese fighters wouldn't get them. Now that was very typical of how aggressive the Japanese were. As you know, an island in the Philippines, when the Japanese overran the Philippines and MacArthur was eventually forced to leave Corridor Island, the small contingent of men who were down on the peninsula down in Bataan, there was a small airstrip down there. They were all captured and they were forced to march the 10-day death march, the Bataan death march. So this was very similar things. So he was keenly attuned to the fact that those men, even though they were part of his crew, he and his crew went down to provide air cover for them. And so despite the damage, despite being low on fuel, despite going further into the teeth of these enemy fighters, they took that risk and they made it back fine. He then volunteered to go out on more missions, and totally, I think they did 44 missions in the B-24. And where's their retired Master Sergeant Phil? You stand, sir? I want to point you out because we talked about the pilots and officers. We wouldn't do anything without our assistants. It's an honor to have you here. So he married his high school sweetheart son, and we then got I think all the family here with us. It's great to have you all here. And in 1959, he said, "I'm just going to go raise chickens." So he bought some land over in Petaluma, and he had a great little ranch over there, and he worked for about 20 years. And I asked him a few minutes ago if he was still in the chicken business. He said, no, I fly my airplane, travel quite a bit these days. So, as we look back, I think you even talked to your sons how to fly. That one phrase that you said to your folks at the 5th Bomber Group, that the better you are as a crew member, the better are your chances of coming home. And those are very powerful words that we need to use today, sir. So the example that you and your crew set on that dark night, way back when, in the perils of World War II, against all odds in many ways, but it's your training, your dedication, and your discipline that brought you back again and again to have you here today. 60 years later, to finally get the recognition that you earned, I can only say that I am absolutely humbled to present this award to you today. And we'll have an opportunity for as many comments or a few comments, whatever you're comfortable with, sir. We're here with you today and your family to pay honor to an American aviator hero, because these distinguished flying crosses don't come easy. I'm so glad that you're finally able to set the record straight and to be able to present this award to you today. Again, thank all the family and friends who are here, because this is a significant day, not only for you, but also for all of us who continue to fight for freedom in Iraq and Afghanistan today with the same sense of discipline and loyalty and patriotism that you, sir, and your crew held with you during all those missions. So let's give them a round of applause. But we hope to have, this is a great setting to do here in the museum. If you've not been here before, I'll see you afterwards and take some time around, because many other heroes who fought in World War II, their stories, their memorabilia is proudly displayed here as well. So with that, back to you, Secretary.
Thank you, Colonel Arquette. Ladies and gentlemen, today we will witness the presentation of the Distinguished Flying Cross to Mr. Arthur J. Cader. The Distinguished Flying Cross was created by Congress over 80 years ago and is America's oldest military aviation award. The Distinguished Flying Cross is awarded to any person who, while serving in any capacity with the Armed Forces of the United States, distinguishes himself or herself by heroism or extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight. From the first recipient, Charles A. Lindbergh, to other aviation heroes such as Orville and Wilbur Wright, Amelia Earhart, Jimmy Doolittle, Curtis LeMay, and John Glenn, Mr. Cader will be joining the prestigious few who have earned the right to wear this medal. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise. Presentation of the Distinguished Flying Cross. Mr. Cader, please join me. Citation to accompany the award of the Distinguished Flying Cross to Arthur J. Cader. First Lieutenant Arthur J. Cader distinguished himself by heroism while participating in an aerial combat flight as the B24 Bomber Pilot for the 72nd Bomber Squadron, 5th Bombardment Group Heavy, 13th Air Force on 30 September 1944. At 0040 hours on that date, 23 B-24 bombers loaded with 10 250-pound bombs and 3,590 gallons of gasoline took off from Pomosaurn Airborne Island to bomb the Candacery refinery at Petaluma, Bolivia. With no fighter escort and only half their normal ammunition due to the heavy bomb load, the B-24 bomber aircraft proceeded to their target 1,080 nautical miles away. Over the target, the aircraft of the 5th Bomber Group encountered strong anti-aircraft fire and between 25 and 35 enemy aircraft from the best Japanese naval air units in the Petaluma. Maintaining the highest degree of situational awareness, Lieutenant Cader, in the face of powerful opposition, performed his duties with courage, coolness, and skill, finding his way into the target and dropping his bombs on the oil refinery. Despite massive damage to his aircraft's fuselage and a supercharger on his No. 3 engine by anti-aircraft fire, his contribution led directly to the 5th Bomb Group's successful placement of 60% of their bombs on one of Japan's newest and most modern aviation gasoline distillation refineries. Throughout these catastrophic circumstances, Lieutenant Cader's airmanship and decisive action were critical in the safe return of the entire B24 crew and aircraft without injury. For his bravery and heroism in volunteering to participate in the face of powerful enemy opposition and extreme danger, Lieutenant Cader is deserving of high commendation. His act was in keeping with the finest traditions of the service. The outstanding heroism and selfless devotion to duty displayed by Lieutenant Cader reflect great credit upon himself and the United States Army Air Corps. Please join me in a well-deserved round of applause.
So with that, I want to thank you all for coming. A big hand for our Cader.